Hi, I'm Jill. Welcome to the Homeschool for Real Life podcast. Do you know what one thing you can include in your reading and writing instruction in the primary grades to build language skills? And you can do it in just a few minutes a day? It's poetry. Let's talk about why poetry is so great for building language skills. First of all, it encourages wordplay. When you listen to poems, you just hear words in fun and interesting ways. Poets are really good at making the most of their words. The poem may not be very long, but you're going to hear a lot of things done, a lot of images created, or a lot of fun sounds used in poetry in just a few words. So all of that wordplay with rhyme and rhythm is really good for building language skills in your child. Poetry also does a really good job naturally drawing attention to spelling patterns, and it makes those spelling patterns meaningful for children. So when you're looking for words that rhyme in the poem and you see that they're spelled the same way, you're going to be looking at how those are spelled. You're drawing your eye to that, and you're comparing the spellings of words and seeing that some sound the same, but they're not spelled the same. So it really just draws our attention to that and gives us a reason to be thinking about it, so that spelling isn't this boring thing that we don't want to do, but it's a clue in the poem, and we just kind of naturally see it there and begin to understand it more and more. Poetry is also really good for shared reading, and shared reading is important because our young children are not always the strongest readers, and shared reading invites them to try reading something that's a bit above their level. It's a way for you to scaffold them, to help them enjoy things that might be outside their reach independently, but when you start with reading it together, it's accessible for them. So with shared reading, usually we as teachers read it first, and then we are using a pointer as we go along, and the child starts joining in, and eventually, if they practice it enough, they're able to read it independently. If it's a poem they really love, they may even repeat it enough that they'll memorize it and be able to recite it. Because we're reading these poems over and over together, they're a really great way to develop fluency. A lot of times young children are not smooth readers because they're doing a lot of work to figure out these words that they're reading. And so by rereading these poems, they get used to what's there. It's less work for them each time, and they're able to read with more fluency. The words come out more smoothly, and they can start using that inflection to communicate the meaning of the words. So we want to start hearing that as they read, and as they become more comfortable with repeating these poems, you're going to hear it more. It's fine to read stories over and over, and sometimes you'll have favorites that they get to do this with. But stories, just because they have to have that beginning, middle, and end, there has to be some plot development there. They tend to be a little bit longer, and they may be more overwhelming for your child to try and read over and over again. And so it takes longer for that to be a tool for developing fluency than it does for poetry. The fun, short poems that we tend to use in the primary grades are ideal for this because it really is not overwhelming for your child to read it many times and become more and more familiar with it. Poetry also invites our young children to become authors, to see themselves as authors. Because it is shorter and less overwhelming, kids tend to be willing to step in the area of poetry. Plus, because there's so many different types of poems, often they'll find something that inspires them and gets them thinking and generates some ideas, and really they won't be able to help themselves but come up with some of their own. So if they're able to write those down on their own, that's wonderful. But if not, be a scribe for them. Help them, because we want them to be generating these ideas, thinking as poets, thinking of themselves as authors with good ideas to write down, and you can help them write those down, and they are an author because those are their ideas on the paper. So handwriting is a separate thing in these young grades from writing. Writing is the ability to generate these ideas and organize our thoughts and put them into wonderful words. Handwriting is just the mechanics, right? And so we don't want that to be holding back their creativity and imagination and their ability to work with words. So poetry can be less overwhelming and invites them to become authors. It also has less rules. We don't have to develop our story so much. We don't necessarily have to have full sentences or completely explained thoughts. We can just stick words in there that bring feelings and images to mind. Poetry gives us a lot more freedom. Some of it rhymes, but not all of it. Some of it has some rhythm in the lines, but not all of it. So your child can play with those things if they want to, but their poem doesn't have to include either one of those. So poetry can be very freeing and kind of provide an entryway for our children to become authors without so many rules constraining them. They can step in. It's a little stepping stone for them to take small steps into the world of being a writer. If they are writing themselves, try not to get too caught up in having them correct their writing, because that's not what this poetry is about. It's about just enjoying the words and the feeling of putting our ideas into words and onto paper. So if their spelling is not correct, oh well, that's okay. That's not the point of what we're doing here, right? So just encourage them as authors and use poetry as a freeing way, a way for them to have freedom to become authors early on. If you are teaching calendar with your child, kindergarten and first grade are ideal for doing calendar time. At H4RL here, we have a whole unit for calendar with all the materials that you need to do that. Poetry is excellent for calendar time because it gives you just a few minutes each day. You can plug in a poem, explore it a little bit together, try some different activities. That way you've got a spot to put it into your day. You remember to do it, but it's not taking up too much. If you're not a member of H4RL yet, you're going to want to be, because in our Poetry for the Primary Grades course, there are over 30 poems to get you started with this. Each poem is printed out for you with illustrations to make it fun, and then a teaching guide with different sorts of activities for you to do. We're looking at the elements of poetry like rhyme and repetition. We use some poetry vocabulary like stanzas and rhyme pattern. And then we also incorporate other things like science into many of the poems. So there's all sorts of activities for you to do, and all those poems ready and waiting to get you started using poetry in the primary grades. Typically, you'll probably use one poem per week. That usually is a good amount of time for your child to get used to the poem, to learn it well enough that they can start to read it independently, and for you to try some of those activities. You may find if it's a poem that they really enjoy, maybe you'll extend it out to 2 weeks. Or maybe you don't like that poem very well and you just move on after a day or two. That's okay. We don't all like all poems, so don't waste too much time on one that isn't engaging your child. You can still share it, talk about it a little bit, talk about how maybe we don't like all poems, and that's all right, but we can pull some value from them and then move on. So about 1 week might be average, but you can certainly adjust that time to whatever works for you and your child. Let's talk now about what to do when you're introducing a new poem to your child. So like I said, we have over 30 poems typed out for you with illustrations to make them look fun. You can use those, print them off, and then as you read them, you'll be able to add them to a poetry notebook and keep all of those together so your child can look back through them as they want to. Another thing you can do, though, is to write the poem on a big poster. So this takes more work, but I did do that with my children for many of our poems because it just stands out. It's something different, like, ooh, here's our poem for the week, this big poster on the wall. And it also, we were able to use big fun pointers and point at the words together. But you don't have to do that. The printed versions are great too. If you can sit right next to each other so both of you can be looking at it together, that's wonderful. So begin by reading the poem aloud yourself. Introduce it to your child. Read it more than once. Give them the chance to hear it a little more closely, some close listening. Try reading it in different ways. Maybe you read it slowly and quickly, and you use inflection in your voice in different ways, and then ask them what they notice. What did they like about the poem? Which way of reading it did they prefer? Just get their thoughts and get them to start engaging with it. Then, as your child becomes more familiar with the poem, you can start pointing to each word as you read. This way they can start joining you in reading it together. So what I like to do is I point to each word, and if the word has more than one syllable, I swoop on the syllables. So we want our children recognizing words that have spaces in between, and then syllables, the parts of words that we swoop for, but we're not going across that space to the next word. Syllables are really important. When we're spelling, they give us a big clue because every syllable pretty much has to have a vowel in it, at least one vowel, or the letter Y. Sometimes it fills in. But it can be really helpful during our spelling, and then also it helps us to dive deeper into our poem, because one of the activities I do a lot in our teaching guides for the poems is actually counting the number of syllables in each line, because often you'll discover a pattern, and that's why the poem sounds so good. That's why we're drawn to it. So point to the words, swoop through the syllables, and let your child read along with you. As we talked about before, as they gain proficiency with the poem and confidence, you can hand the pointer over to them, and they can lead the reading and eventually be doing it completely independently. Don't underestimate the power of poetry to engage your kids. A lot of times people think kids won't like poetry, and sometimes kids think they won't like poetry. My son cracks me up because I'll say, "Hey, buddy, I found this new poem. Do you want to hear it?" Okay. And then I'll find that as I keep reading, he gets more and more into it. He's drawn in. Poetry does this to us. And by the end, he's like, "Wow, that was great. That was really cool. Can you read it again?" So he really cracks me up with that. But you have to make sure you're choosing the right poetry for your child, right? I'm not reading to him poems that are pages long and have deep, flowery descriptions of emotions and meadows. That's not going to do it for him, right? And he and my daughter tend to have different favorite poems. She really loves wordplay and beautiful descriptions done in words. She likes language. And so hearing language used well really draws her in, where it's not as interesting for my son. He likes poems with a lot of rhythm to them, and he likes funny poems, and they both enjoy the ones that have a surprise at the end. A lot of times poems will do that. We're going along, and then right at the end they'll throw in something different. There are several in our primary poetry collection that have endings like that. So as long as you are using appropriate poems, you may really be surprised by how drawn in your children are and how much they enjoy hearing them and thinking about them and the significant thoughts that they can contribute to a discussion about poetry. So that's the other thing, is don't underestimate your child's ability to understand the poems and contribute significant ideas to your discussions about them, or even to write some pretty amazing poetry on their own. Our kids are really capable of hearing what's so special about this language and discovering what's so much fun about these poems and thinking of creative ideas to create poems of their own. So don't underestimate their ability. Enjoy being surprised by what they think of, and go ahead and challenge them. Use poetic language like stanza and rhyme and meter, and invite them to use it with you. It's really just as easy for your child to hear you say, this chunk of lines right here, this group of lines, call it a stanza. You tell them one time, "I'm talking about this group of lines here that's bunched together. That's a stanza." They've got it. They're with you. Your kindergartner then is talking about stanzas in poems. Why not? They can learn what that word means just as easily as they can hear you say this group of lines that has space around it, right? It simplifies things, really, if you just go ahead and use it. So don't underestimate the ability of poetry to draw your child in, or your child to rise to the occasion with poems. However, don't push it too hard either. Because remember, the goal is for them to delight in language, to love reading and writing, to learn through this poetry, gain some language skills, develop fluency as a reader. That's the goal. Really, our deepest goal is just for them to love learning, to become lifelong learners and readers and writers, right? And so we're not going to do that if we force it too much. So there are days that your child just may not be into poetry. So if you read through it once, you can tell they're not really with it, move on, right? Maybe tomorrow they'll be in a better poetry mood and you'll be able to spend more time looking at that poem. Or you may just find that poem just doesn't do it for them. And so you'll move on more quickly with that one. So make sure you keep your main goals in mind as you do this. We can't be forcing poetry. Our main goal is not that they recognize the pattern of rhyme in this one poem, or that this imagery is a simile and it means this. That's not the main goal. Those are our small little extra goals, but the main goal is a love of learning, an ability to understand what we're reading, right? These are our main goals. So keep those in mind when you're making your instructional decisions and paying attention to how your child is feeling about it that day. Thank you for joining me for this podcast from Homeschool for Real Life. If you enjoyed it, click like or subscribe. Make sure to check out our other videos and visit us at h4rl.com.